Hi friends, this is author and illustrator Cedar McLeod here to chat with you about world building while I work on the painting for my next book cover for my upcoming release, The Flame That Sings. I'm even including the drawing portion of my painting process, which I don't normally do. This cover is designed to match the first cover of the book as well as the second. Here you can see I'm working off of the original sketch for book one, and I've already done some of it without recording, so I apologize, but we're getting into the process now. While I sketch, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I did the world building for this book series, which is called the Eternal Library series. This topic was chosen by my paid patrons over on Patreon, so a big thank you to everybody over there. I'm really happy to talk about this. It's one of my favorite things about being a writer, and especially being a fantasy writer. For me, world building begins with the initial concept for the book or series. In this case, it was all the way back in 2015, so a full 10 years ago, that I had the initial idea for what would become the Eternal Library series. And it was just a simple what-if question. What if ink magic, paper magic, and thread magic could be combined to make book magic? Bookbinding magic specifically. Side note, I hate when the lead comes out of the pencil like this when you sharpen it. It's so annoying. To dip back into the drawing process for a second, right now I'm using my phone to go into my many Pinterest boards to find some references for outfits I might want to use for this drawing. It's the equivalent of the early 80s in the book now, so I really like this 80s chunky sweater for June. Back to the world building. Once I have my base concept, I usually play around with it a lot in my head, imagining what it means, what it would take to create such a world, what the magic system would be like, lots of internal daydreaming, especially while listening to music. The next step along with my daydreams is almost always to do character drawings. The first character I ever drew for the Eternal Library series was Rhiannon. I envisioned Rhiannon as an ink mage, initially someone with magic tattoos, which was something that didn't end up in the series, but was an early idea for the world building. This idea that you could have tattoos of tools on your body and then lift them off magically and use them and then put them right back on your skin. That concept didn't end up getting used in the book at all. The magic ended up being mostly lower stakes, lower magic than that. Ugh, it happened again. I hate Prismacolor pencils. Back to Crayolas for actual sketching without breakage. By the way, I sketch in colored pencil, one, so I can use different colors to keep different elements separate from each other, and also because later I am going to go over it with regular dark graphite pencil so that I can differentiate the actual lines I'm going to trace onto the watercolor paper from all of the sketchiness. This way I don't have to erase constantly. Anyway, with world building a new series, there's always a lot of ideas that come and go, that don't get used for one reason or another, and that's a completely normal part of the process. Most concepts like this stay in idea form and inside my sketchbook for quite a long time before they ever make it into a book, usually because they come up while I'm already working on another project. So during this preliminary phase, it's mostly drawings, daydreams, and also taking in a lot of inspiration from other sources. The next stage is usually what I'll call the vomit draft. Sorry for the name, but it is a reference to the fact that I will just sit down and let the words pour out without regard to the quality of the words. I'm just getting the story down on paper. As I think Terry Pratchett said, the first draft is you telling yourself the story, and for my process, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. During this initial draft, I'm mostly just making stuff up as I go. Whatever comes to mind, I will just put it down, let it be that way, even if the world building in that draft is not consistent. Back to the drawing process for a second. I'm now going to take a 4B very dark graphite pencil and magically trace over everything that I want to keep. There it is. Now I will take this over to my light table. I also have the original sketch from the book 1 cover, which I'm going to use to retrace the bookshelf frame so I don't have to draw it a second time. That's called efficiency. Then I just line up the new character section and trace that as well. Now I have a clean copy on watercolor paper to paint on. It turns out it's been a while since I painted last, and my paint jar has evaporated into this sludge, so we're going to get a clean one. Yay! So one of my favorite techniques with the initial vomit draft is that whenever I hit a detail of some kind, especially a place name, a minor character name, something like that, I will literally type brackets and then put like in all caps name or something like that instead of coming up with it on the spot. This allows me to keep the flow and the pace of that initial draft, and I just go back and fill in those details later. As far as filling in those details goes, now we're getting into the more meaty part of the world building process. There are 3 sources of knowledge, mainly, that I use when it comes to world building for my fantasy series, and in particular the Eternal Library series. The first is my existing personal knowledge base, which in this case was what I already know about real-life magic and witchcraft, card reading, and arts and crafts. The magic system in the Eternal Library series is largely based on my experience of real-life witchcraft and paganism or polytheism. I discovered witchcraft and Wicca and paganism and all of that when I was 10 or 11, and I was hiding library books under my bed so my mom wouldn't find them in the early 2000s. That was followed by, a good 20 years of being part of that community and studying those things, doing magic. As such, the magic in this series is kind of if you took ordinary Western witchcraft and kicked it up a few notches. That was just an easy thing for me to do, and I could just use my existing knowledge base and experience in order to come up with those ideas. Similarly, being a lifelong artist and crafty type person also gave me a lot of knowledge to work with when it comes to the crafty and art side of the world building. I then combined those 2 knowledge databases in order to come up with so much of what is the basis of this series as far as the magical craft goes. Similarly, the geography and climate that this series takes place in is based on my time living in Seattle, basing the main city it takes place in as well as the rest of the country on a real-world place, even though this is a fantasy world, just does a lot to make things easier on the world building end. Once I've created the base of the world building with the knowledge that I already have, that's when I go in and I start researching. And by researching, I simply mean I read a lot of nonfiction books and watch documentaries. For the Eternal Library series in particular, of course, one of the first things I researched was historical and modern bookbinding. This would include titles like A Degree of Mastery by Annie Tremmel Wilcox, The Medieval Scriptorium by Sara J. Charles, and Bookbinding and Conservation, A 60-Year Odyssey of Art and Craft by Dawn Etherington. To find these books, I would simply start with a Google search. In some cases, it did take me a while to find what I was looking for, especially when it came to the history of books, reading, and libraries in particular. I didn't really know what section of the library to find them in, and I don't know, it was just a little difficult. Some more notes on the painting process. My work is primarily watercolor. However, I do use acrylic paint markers like Posca, colored pencils, watercolor pencils, and alcohol markers in the same pieces as well. And one of the main reasons I don't tape down my painting like a lot of people do is so that I can turn it around like this and get a better angle. The other reason is that Most of my work is intended for print, specifically what's called a full bleed, where the print goes all the way to the edges, which means that I actually have to have parts of the painting that go beyond the trim line for when it's printed and trimmed to size. And I do not feel like doing the math to include the white border that tape would leave all the way around the edges. Luckily, I don't mind the little bit of warping that happens to the paper, and later you'll even see me bend it back into shape a bit, which I can do since I use high quality papers, although if you're going to do that, be careful. On the painting side now, I'm using an alcohol marker to separate and give detail to the books on the rainbow bookshelf. When it comes to adding detail to paintings like this, it's actually easier to go with the illusion of detail rather than try to get it all exactly right. Through drawing these bookshelves a few times, I have come up with some easy little lines and such to add that make it look like they have titles or spines that are more interesting than leaving them blank, but there's not actually any real information there, and they're not particularly accurate to real life. Back to talking about the research that I did for this series. The next topic, which I mentioned, was, of course, the history of books reading in libraries. Some favorites of mine were A History of Reading by Alberto Manguel, Patience and Fortitude by Nicholas A. Basbanes, The Madman's Library by Edward Brooke Hitching, The Library, A Catalog of Wonders by Stuart Kells, and, of course, The Library Book by Susan Orlean. If you're interested in any of these books, don't worry about pausing to write them down. I will include a recommended reading list in the description of this video for you. One of my favorite topics of research for this series was the materials and craft side. One of my absolute favorite books that I read for research was Color, A Natural History of the Palette by Victoria Finlay. It was just so incredible and really long, but an absolutely fascinating look into where a lot of our pigments come from historically and modernly. It helps that when it comes to a lot of these nonfiction books, I listened to most of them in audio form while out for really long walks or just my daily regular walk. That certainly helped me to feel less like I was spending so much time researching for this book. Also worth mentioning that all these books were read over many years, actually. I put the first book out in 2020 and the second book out in 2023, and now it is 2025, and I have continued to research through that whole period. As for other topics that I read a lot of books or watched documentaries on, of course, there is Pacific Northwest ecology, botany, geography, and indigenous history. I no longer live in Seattle or the Pacific Northwest, but I still have my plant and field guides from when I did. And seeing as in this world, in this story, the characters are making books from scratch with their own plants and foraged materials, that's really important. I also highly recommend the book Tahoma and Its People by Jeff Antonellis Lapp, which talks about the history and ecology of what we now call Mount Rainier. Tahoma is one of its original indigenous names. And this beautiful stratovolcano, which you can see all the way from Seattle on a clear day, was the direct inspiration for Mount Kinid in the Eternal Library series, which is an important place to several of the characters, as well as the home to a very important deity. Ooh, now we're finally getting to painting the characters on this book cover. On the left, we're starting with June, who was one of the older mentor figures in Book 1, and then the main character and narrator of Book 2, The Tale That Twines, which was the start of the prequel part of the series where the mentor characters are younger. This book, Book 3, continues the prequel story and is narrated by Aaronwe, with June still a main character, but not a narrator. Like me, June is agender and autistic and has ADHD, which is something that I explored in the previous book in particular, as I hadn't had my diagnosis or my revelation when I wrote the first book. As such, in the first book, there are no diagnosis labels. None of the characters are specifically called autistic or ADHD, but the traits are absolutely there if you know how to recognize them. And that's just how things go sometimes. Occasionally, it gets frustrating because in some spaces, it feels like these days, if you don't explicitly label it on the page, people don't want to call it quote unquote representation. But the truth is that our own identities as authors are pretty complicated. And in the case of The Thread That Binds, I feel like the neurodivergent representation is there, even though they don't use the words. And I don't know if one day I might go back in and edit them in here or there, at least once. But I hope that if you are autistic or ADHD, that you might still see yourself in it and still enjoy it, even if they don't have the exact labels until the second book. This is a good enough point to mention that when it comes to how gender is portrayed and seen in this world, specifically that in the country of Caspora, where the story takes place, they do not have a social concept of gender. That came from my own experiences as an agender person. Early on, I actually went back and forth over whether I wanted their culture to have no gender or to have like 5 billion genders. I think either could have worked for my purposes of creating a society where people like myself were welcome and normalized. In the end, I went with a little bit of a compromise where traditionally Caspora has no social concept of gender, and in their language, there's originally only one pronoun, which is er. However, Caspora is also a very diverse place, especially the capital city where most of the books take place. It is a center of knowledge in their world, and as such, there are a lot of people who come from other countries to study or to settle down there. And they have brought with them their own concepts of gender and made neopronouns, which to us might be neopronouns like ze, here, or ni, nem, or it might be he and she. Basically, I just wanted a world where my own experiences and thoughts were centered. The same goes for how sexual and romantic orientations are approached in this world. Again, my goal was to create a world that I would want to live in. That's not always what you want to do with your world building and your story, but it was in this case. As such, not only is queerness normalized, but specifically aromantic and asexual spectrum identities are well known. Most of the characters fall in those spectrums somewhere, as I myself am ace and gray aromantic. Obviously, if you wanted to do a story that talks about oppression or erasure, then you would world build it differently. There's not a right or wrong answer when it comes to those things. It's all about what it is you're trying to say. When it comes to the words used in the stories for those things, I have gone with our modern terminology, largely because, well, the Eternal Library series takes place in a modern fantasy world. They have technology, they have the internet, they have computers, they have everything that we have, though a lot of it works via magic or crystals and things like that. That said, personally, even if you have a more medieval style fantasy, I think using our modern terminology is fine in most cases because it is fantasy after all. It doesn't have to be quote-unquote historically accurate to our world as long as it makes sense in the context. This is a good segue to point out that for the Eternal Library series, when it comes to world building, their history, especially when it comes to technology, I have mostly looked to our own world and our own history for the answers. The Eternal Library series does take place on a planet called Earth. It is not specifically alternate Earth fiction, but it's not alternate Earth fiction, if that makes sense. Basically, I take what I want to be inspired by, and then I change the rest as needed. To keep track of those sort of details and timelines, I have documents in Scrivener, which is the program that I use to write, so that I can refer to them anytime that I'm writing. If you're not familiar with Scrivener, it is a writing program that allows you to have multiple nested documents within the larger document of the work. They can be part of the story itself, like separate documents for each chapter, and there are also sections for notes and research that are not included in the main novel for word count or compiling, I guess unless you want to. and you can split screen it. So usually I have on my monitor, one side is pulled up to the actual writing, and the other side has whatever reference or list that I need. This is especially good for names, but again, also for things like timelines and dates and historical moments. The Eternal Library series takes place over a decently large period of time since it is essentially an intergenerational saga. The first book takes place in the equivalent of 2018, but the prequel series takes place in the equivalent of 1978 to 1986. And as such, I definitely need to keep track of like when people's birthdays are so I know how old they are, when certain technological advances happened. And as such, another topic of research for me has been the history of technology. So I know what my characters roughly should have available to them in like the 70s and 80s. Since I was born in 1990, that was before my time. On the screen right now, you can see me finishing up the details on June's section of the painting using watercolor pencils. I don't go back over them to activate them with water as the watercolor pencils are intended for, but these Caran d'Ache super color pencils are just really good. I love them so much just as a colored pencil, and I highly recommend them. One thing I really enjoyed for the world building of book 2, for June's book in particular, was the history of fan culture and science fiction. June is essentially their world's equivalent of a Trekkie. And this was inspired because my partner is a huge Trekkie. So I took huge inspiration from his love, not only of Star Trek, including classic Star Trek, but also Doctor Who, including the classic Doctor Who, and many other things like older tokusatsu and mecha anime. And I sort of made up my own versions of those genres and things for the Eternal Library series. The book series and show that is analogous to Star Trek in their world, which June is obsessed with, the Planet of Honey series, was an idea I came up with completely separately at first. I had read a science fiction book where a alien and a human fell in love, and I really didn't like it. And I thought I could do this so much better, and came up with the idea of like the bee aliens and all of that. Now a little bit of gold gel pen. It's just a little easier to do some of these last minute details and outlines with pencils and pens rather than with a paintbrush. I have dyspraxia, which means that I struggle with both large and small motor control, and pencils and pens simply offer more control than a small paintbrush does. And one of the things I've been doing with the ideas for stories that I don't have time for is put them into the Eternal Library series, because this series, by its nature, has a lot of books within the book, and I have to create their whole pop culture on my own. And so my own story ideas are just like a great well to pull from whenever I need something like that. And it is something I have done multiple times now. Another one of my favorite books I have read for research for this series was called Astounding: John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction by Alec Navala Lee. This is exactly what it sounds like. It follows the early history of English science fiction writers, specifically some of the biggest and most well-known names in the genre. And I just thought it was absolutely fascinating and super engaging. Highly recommend. Some other topics that I researched for this series included folk tales and fairy tales. So just reading lots of compilations of folk tales and fairy tales was a big part. I've always loved fairy tales, and so do multiple of the characters in this series, unsurprisingly. Erinwy, in particular, is a big lover of folk tales and is the narrator of this next book, so that was important. Erinwy is also a religious cult survivor, and so I did read several books on the the nature of cults, but especially memoirs by people who have survived religious cults. This helped me to hopefully create a culture and a group and a situation that will feel realistic to readers and be mindful and respectful to people's real lived experience, since this is not something that I have experienced in my own life. For this topic, the book I recommend the most is In the Shadow of the Moons, My Life in the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Family by Nan Suk Hung. Her story is deeply moving, and in my experience, once you read accounts from people who have survived many of the cults that are known in pop culture, such as the Moonies in this case, that sometimes people make jokes about. See Drinking the Kool-Aid as a reference to Jonestown, which is another one that I have read some books about. It really changes your perspective on joking about those sorts of things and how you view people who have been in and survived cults. And so I highly recommend it as just a general topic to learn more about, even if it is a very difficult one at times. And it really, really is. Now, after much meandering, on to the third source of knowledge that I mentioned that I use for world building. The first was my existing knowledge. The second was books and documentaries, and the third is hands-on learning. Over the last 7 or more years, I have personally tried out many of the crafts that my characters use in this series, including but not limited to drop spinning, weaving, paint making, pigment making, paper making, and of course, bookbinding. This means that when I write about those things in the book, I have very specific hands-on experience from which to draw, which really is even better than book knowledge when it comes to physical crafts and things of that nature. Was this just an excuse for me to try a whole bunch of crafts that I've always wanted to do and then write them off on my taxes? You decide. Some additional places that I get world building details are from my many Pinterest boards, which of course are a conglomeration of images and links from all across the web. They are especially useful, as you saw earlier in this video, for fashion references. Again, this comes in handy in particular when I'm working on the prequel era books like this one, and I need examples of actual clothing from the 70s and 80s. Now, if you just search for like 80s style clothing, most of what you'll get is modern clothing that is 80s inspired. And as such, another source of information that I've utilized quite a lot is old advertisements. And also for clothing, old sewing patterns. One particular instance in which I used an old advertisement was to describe Inyene's huge TV and VCR combo in Book 2. When I was growing up, I collected National Geographics, both the ones as they were coming out and older ones from before I was born, because I've always been that kind of nerd. And I had from them this specific memory of an advertisement for this giant TV that was just enormous and super old. And I managed to find it again on the internet. I'll pop it up on the screen for you so you can see it, because I just wanted him to have like the biggest TV possible at the time. Advertisements can also help with understanding what things cost in the past, although with this series I have overall tried to avoid using specific numbers when I talk about money. And in fact, I think I've only mentioned that their money is called reams a few times in the text. A ream, of course, being a measurement term for 500 sheets of paper. Little world-building details like that, such as what to name their currency, often for me come from synthesizing all of the various information that I've already talked about and picking out little details to reference. When you start with a concept like a society that's built around books, bookbinding, and those sorts of crafts, you can figure out a lot more about the world if you just ask yourself a lot of further questions and take it to the logical conclusion, you might say. For example, in Casporan society, people like authors and artists and bookbinders are the top of the social pole rather than, say, TV celebrities or actors or athletes. Back on the painting front, I'm now working on the middle panel, which is younger Erinwy, the narrator and main character for this book. I have had some extra world building to do for Erinwy because Erinwy belongs to an ethno-religion called Kennedism, which revolves around the deity of the volcano mentioned earlier. At the heart of this culture are flamekeepers, or people who have within them a magical flame that allows them to handle fire, to breathe fire, and to use it for specific cultural practices. These flames were gifts from their deity Kinned and are passed down generationally once a flamekeeper dies to another person who is prepared with a special tattoo and magic and then takes it within themselves and is transformed. Erinwy is not only a flamekeeper, but holds one of the original 6 flames that were gifted from Kinned. The Kinnedites are primarily an oral storytelling culture, and the flames store memories from the people who have held them, including the stories that need to be passed down and told through the generations. In a series about the power of storytelling and books, I thought it was extremely important to also showcase the importance of oral storytelling and oral culture in order to get a more rounded view of the topic. I also wanted there to be variation within the religions in this society. Just as there are in real life, you don't see any religion in our world as a single monolith. There are many branches to them. As such, for both Kennedism and the major religion, Scriptivism, there are multiple branches. There are primarily 2 of each, which boil down effectively to a more liberal branch and a more conservative branch for each. With Scriptivism, there are the readerists and authorists, so some who believe that the idea of the universe being a book is just a metaphor, and that, like any reader reading a text, we have the ability to interpret what is going on with our lives and what our own stories are. And then there are the authorists who take things literally and are a type of fundamentalist. They do believe that there is a universal author who has written all of existence from the past all the way through the future and believe in predestination, as well as some other troubling things like believing that a person is born into a specific type of character role, whether that makes you a protagonist or some sort of side character or a love interest, and that you are supposed to stick to that role and not deviate from it. On the Kennedite side, there are traditionalists and modernists. Traditionalists belong to lineages who, during the historic theocracy period in this country, moved away from the capital city and were able to effectively keep their culture going without interruption, while the modernists were lineages that were sort of broken or lost or hidden on the coast during the theocracy while they were being persecuted and were revived later after the theocracy was toppled by the revolution. As you can see, I am still trying to fix this eyeball, and nope, I messed it up a second time. And I'm going to mess it up even more trying to dab at it with this tissue, even though I knew it was a bad idea. As one might expect, the traditionalists tend to be stricter and more orthodox in their beliefs, while the modernists are a bit looser and more open to change. I explain all of this in order to point out that I did not come up with all of this religious world building in one go. I did not know all of it prior to starting the first book, not even before starting the second book, honestly. Much like the mistakes I keep making on Erinwy's left eye here, the world building process has been a process. I have unfortunately been stuck with some decisions after publishing them, but in other cases, things can be a little fudged, especially when you have first person narrators who you can just blame for getting something wrong. One thing I struggled with was making Erinwe part of a minority ethno-religion that is based on oral storytelling and was historically oppressed by the majority theocracy. But I also made some of Erinwe's trauma stem from the religious upbringing that he had, and not wanting to make that particular religion out to be the villains. That's how I ended up with the idea that Erinwe had been raised in a cult offshoot of this religion. So they are not really representative of that culture as a whole. Additionally, one of Erinwe's main arcs in this next book is a return to that culture, the real culture, and what that even means and what it looks like outside of the cult. So sometimes mistakes, if you want to call them that, can actually lead to more interesting story decisions and more complex world building. I know that some people like to have everything figured out before they actually start working on the book, but that has never been the way that my mind works. When I was in art school, I used to complain to my professors who wanted me to do tons and tons of preparatory sketches for my pieces, that I didn't work that way, that I worked by discovering the piece as I was making it. And that is somewhat true for my writing these days as well, though I definitely plan a lot more ahead of time than I did when I was younger. I used to call myself a pantser when I was younger and writing. I just kind of wrote by the seat of my pants, as they say. And these days I do outline beforehand. I leave this in here again because making mistakes or coming up with multiple iterations of a thing, working on a thing multiple times, changing it, that's all a really important part of the creative process. And personally, I don't think there's anybody who's going to get it all 100% right the first time you sit down and write or draw something. With the example of the eye in this painting, you could see I took a break from trying to fix it and did some other things in the meantime. I think that's just good in general if you feel frustrated about something in your work to take a step back and maybe take some time away. It's really important to give your brain off time to let things sort of bubble and mix in the background. I can't tell you how many of my best ideas for plots or characters or solutions to existing ones or things for world building just sort of arose from my brain while I was doing something relaxing like playing video games or reading or going for a walk. One final world building thought. Sometimes you'll see people, especially very well-known published authors, suggest that in speculative fiction, you have to know every single detail about how your world works. I recall a tweet by, I want to say it was Daniel Jose Older, but I'm not sure, I can't find it, that you needed specifically to know where the poop goes and what sports they play in your made-up world. And I don't think that's bad advice, but if you take it too literally or too deeply when it's not relevant to your world, I don't think it's necessarily that helpful, depending on your project. I have not deeply thought about or addressed on page the sort of sports that they might have or play in Caspora. I'm sure they do. But the point is that if you did ask me, I could conceivably come up with some ideas. In this world, they might play things that we know, like soccer or hockey. And because I know the world so well, I could also easily extrapolate that they might value more academic sport contests. Like maybe they have like mathletes or high-end spelling bees or something like that. On the poop side, Caspora is a modern civilization, so I assume they have modern plumbing, so I don't feel the need to address that too much. Although, actually, they're supposed to have a somewhat solar punk kind of world setup when it comes to technology and energy. So I imagine they have like wastewater treatment plants that recycle and things like that. But there's no reason for it to come up in the story. On the other hand, in my friend Claudia Arsenault's City of Spires series, there are multiple references to the shit slides, which are a part of the city's infrastructure for sewage and take on a special meaning in the culture and swearing and where people work according to class and all sorts of things. So the point isn't necessarily about knowing those specific things so much as it is knowing your world well enough that if someone were to ask you a specific question, like where does the poop go, you could come up with a reasonable answer without too much difficulty. At least that's my personal take on it. Of course, this sort of thing varies by different authors, and the way I do it isn't necessarily the right way. There is really no right way to do world building, just like there's not really a right way to write a book or tell a story. It's all about what you are personally trying to express and how you wish to express it. And then how people interpret it, how people feel about it, and whether or not your attempt at communication was successful. One world building aspect I'm excited to explore more of in the next book, book 4, and probably book 5 as well, is games, specifically video games in the Eternal Library universe. Book 4 is narrated by both Erinwe and June, and on June's side, the story will be focusing on the setup of the Astronet, which is their version of the internet. As such, June is definitely going to be playing around with computers and computer games. I'm not a hardcore gamer, but I do love video games, and I've been enjoying researching the history and origins of video games. This book will take place in the equivalent of the mid-80s, so it's a really ripe time for video games and the evolution of the genre of the medium. So I'm really excited about that. I think in Caspora, given how literary they are, I really want to follow the idea that text-based RPGs were super popular there, like more so than they even were in real life. Also, anything that today we would classify as interactive fiction, so things like dating sims and visual novels, I think are something I'm going to explore, along with how the internet connects people, which at first will probably be pretty positive in the prequel book. And then in book 5, when we return to the modern day, it will probably have more downsides given, the way the internet in real life is today. That and ebooks are going to be a big feature in this series moving forward for sure. So for me, world building comes from taking a bunch of information, whether that's information I already had or that's new to me that I've sought out, and then drawing from that base whenever I need to answer a world building question in my book. There's also just an element of doing what I think is fun. I mean, ultimately, the person that I'm writing my books for is me. Now, I've said just about all I had to say on the topic of world building for this series, but there's a few minutes left in this video, so I guess we'll have time for a second topic. One of the other topics that got votes on the Patreon poll was why we should make art during difficult times. And to that, I say, why shouldn't we make art in difficult times? I understand where this comes from, especially in the context of posting our creative work to the internet for other people to see, and 10 times so if we are trying to sell something. It can feel really strange to do that when on the same platform we are seeing all of the news about all of the terrible things that are going on around the world and within our own countries. Of course, there are times and places where we should be sensitive about what we're saying and how, but the thing about art is that, in my opinion anyway, its primary use is a way of expressing ourselves and expressing our emotions, our viewpoints, and our experiences. Creativity is an innate part of being human. It does not lessen someone else's struggle if you are making art and sharing it. This does not have to be an either or black and white situation. We can acknowledge all of the things that are going on around us that need action, that need response, and we can still make art. It doesn't even have to be art about those things that are happening. Though, of course, historically, making art as a response to what's happening in the world around us and how we feel about it is really prevalent. That includes, in my opinion, art that paints a picture, whether with words or actual paint, whatever your medium is, of a better world than the one we currently live in. After all, what is it that we're fighting for? What is it that we want to protect, that we want to preserve, that at the end of the day is going to bring us and the people in our lives, and potentially even people we don't know, happiness? Art, even very so-called non-serious art, can be a healing balm to so many people. I always think of this during the pandemic years in particular. I started watching a lot of YouTube. And one of my favorite channels, which is still a favorite channel, is the wonderful Rachel Maxey, who you probably know. And if you don't, she does a lot of crafting and fashion and cosplay, and is just all around a super relatable and cool creative. I remember at some point her apologizing for making silly content when things in the world were so serious. And the comments, of course, were full of people telling her that her quote unquote silly content was one of the things that was helping them relax and feel normal and rejuvenated against all the stress in the outside world. And that's no small thing. Some of those viewers were frontline workers, like ICU nurses, who were seeing the worst of the pandemic at the time. Art is a language that we use to connect with one another, even when our experiences are different, even when we might actually speak different languages entirely. It brings us happiness, it brings us hope, and it brings us together. That, to me, is reasoning why we should absolutely be making art, maybe even more art, during the most difficult times in history. Now, if you are not feeling regulated, if you are depressed, if you are anxious, and you simply can't get yourself to create, that's okay. This isn't a message meant to pressure you into feeling like, well, you should be making art. This message is more for people who want to be making art, who are making art, and are feeling guilty about it. Art alone is not going to save the world, but it isn't something that we need to abandon in these times. And now I'm just about wrapping up on this painting. I'm just finishing these two little sections in the frame with a calm volcano and an erupting volcano. If you're one of my longtime fans, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have enjoyed the chat topics of this video, as well as a view of the painting process. If you're new to my work and you'd like to see more, you can head over to my website at numinouspiritpress.com and check out all of the different things I do there, including my books and my tarot and oracle decks. As mentioned, I have a Patreon, which you can join for free and see posts just about once a week. I share lots of behind the scenes stuff and little extras. I've been having a lot of fun with it that way. And yeah, that's just about it for today's video. This book, The Flame That Sings, which is the third book in the Eternal Library series, will be coming to BackerKit crowdfunding on June 2nd. Link in the description. Bye.